What happens when a victim finally speaks and the story suddenly becomes bigger than one man? For years, Diddy has been the name at the center of whispers, lawsuits, and closed-door conversations. But now a victim is stepping forward and saying this wasn't happening in isolation. According to her account, powerful figures were in the room. Powerful figures heard things. Powerful figures saw enough to know something wasn't right, and still, nothing changed. And that's where the story takes a dangerous turn. Because once these names were mentioned, internet went silent. Terrence Howard, Steve Harvey, Beyoncé, not accused of committing crimes, but questioned for what they may have known, what they may have witnessed, and what they may have chosen to ignore. In an industry built on access and silence, those questions matter more than accusations. This isn't about cancel culture. It's about accountability. The victim describes an environment where speaking up meant losing everything: careers, protection, safety. She claims the power imbalance was so extreme that silence became survival, not just for victims, but for everyone watching from the sidelines. And when people at the top stay quiet, that silence becomes part of the system. Hollywood loves to celebrate strengths, justice, and empowerment, but what happens when those values are tested behind closed doors? If even a fraction of what's being alleged is true, then the real scandal isn't just what Diddy is accused of. It's how many people allegedly knew something was wrong and still chose comfort over confrontation. This isn't a verdict. It's a question. And once you hear it, you can't unhear it. For years, this story existed in fragments: quiet conversations, nervous laughter, side comments that never made it into interviews or headlines. Whenever Diddy's name surfaced, it was usually followed by a pause, the kind that suggests people knew more than they were willing to say. In an industry built on access and alliances, silence often becomes the price of survival. According to a victim who has now chosen to speak publicly, what happened wasn't limited to one individual or one moment in time. She describes an environment where power wasn't just visible, it was absolute. An environment where certain behaviors were normalized behind closed doors, and where questioning them could cost someone their career, their protection, or their future. Her story does not open with accusations. It opens with fear. She explains that in these spaces, everything felt controlled. Who entered the room? Who stayed? Who spoke? Who didn't? Fame and influence acted like a barrier that discouraged accountability. The more powerful someone was, the less likely anyone around them felt comfortable asking questions. And over time, that silence became routine. What makes her account unsettling is not what she claims happened, but what she claims people around her may have noticed. She suggests that some individuals present in these circles appeared aware that something wasn't right. Not necessarily aware of details, not necessarily participating, but aware enough to feel uncomfortable and still choose not to intervene. That's where the story begins to widen. When certain names were mentioned publicly, the reaction was immediate and intense. Terrence Howard, Steve Harvey, Beyoncé, none of them accused of committing crimes. None of them named as perpetrators, but mentioned in connection to proximity, presence, or awareness. And that alone was enough to ignite controversy. In the court of public opinion, proximity can feel like guilt. But the victim's words don't suggest that. What she raises instead is a moral question. If someone sees signs that something is wrong, how much responsibility do they have to speak up? And does that responsibility change when power, money, and influence are involved? She describes how difficult it was to even recognize abuse when it's wrapped in luxury, when the setting looks glamorous, when everyone around you treats the situation as normal. Over time, she says, reality becomes distorted. What feels wrong gets rationalized. What feels dangerous gets minimized. And what feels impossible to escape starts to feel permanent. According to her account, this wasn't a world where victims felt empowered to speak. It was a world where speaking meant isolation, where reputations were quietly destroyed, where opportunities vanished overnight. She suggests that the fear of retaliation wasn't imagined, it was observed. That fear didn't only affect victims. It affected bystanders too, in spaces where powerful figures moved freely. People learned to protect themselves by staying neutral, by not asking questions, by not looking too closely. The victim suggests that this culture of avoidance became so ingrained that even well-known figures learned to look away if it meant preserving their position. That's the uncomfortable part of this conversation because it forces a distinction between legality and morality, between what someone can be charged with and what they chose to ignore. The victim is careful with her words. She doesn't say these celebrities caused harm. She questions whether they had enough awareness to act, and whether silence was a conscious decision. Hollywood has always struggled with this reckoning, time and time again. Scandals reveal the same pattern. Powerful individuals operate openly for years. Rumors circulate, jokes are made, warnings are whispered, and yet nothing changes until someone speaks. Publicly, often at great personal cost. The victim describes feeling trapped inside that pattern. She claims that for a long time she believed nobody would listen, that her voice would be drowned out by fame, lawyers, and public relations machines. That belief, she says, was reinforced every time someone influential stayed quiet. When the story finally began to surface, reactions were divided. Some dismissed it immediately. Others demanded proof before even considering the possibility. And some focused entirely on the famous names involved, ignoring the person at the center of the account. That response, she says, was painful but predictable. In her view, society is more comfortable debating celebrity involvement than listening to victims describe power dynamics. It's easier to argue about whether someone knew than to confront how often people choose not to know. The mention of Beyoncé in particular triggered strong reactions. For many, she represents empowerment, control, and independence. The idea that her name could even appear in such a conversation felt jarring. But again, the victim does not accuse. She questions visibility, presence, awareness, and that distinction matters because this story isn't asking viewers to pick villains. It's asking them to examine how influence shapes behavior, how silence can be strategic, how careers can become dependent on not rocking the boat, and how systems protect themselves by discouraging accountability. The victim explains that when you're inside these environments, it becomes difficult to tell where responsibility begins and ends. Power blurs lines. Loyalty gets confused with morality, and fear overrides instinct. She says the most damaging part wasn't what happened. It was the realization that others might have noticed, still said nothing. That realization, she claims, made the silence feel intentional rather than accidental. As more people began discussing her story, a familiar pattern emerged. Deflection, denial, calls for patience. Statements emphasizing neutrality. All of it legally safe. All of it emotionally distant. And that's where part one ends. Not with conclusions, not with accusations, but with a question that refuses to go away. When power is that concentrated and silence is that common, who is truly responsible? The one who acts or the many who look away? After the initial shock of her words settled, the conversation moved from disbelief to discomfort. The victim's account did not escalate into dramatic accusations or sensational claims. Instead, it slowed down. It became more detailed, more precise. And that's what made it harder to dismiss. She began describing specific moments where silence, in her view, stopped being accidental and started feeling intentional. She speaks about instances where her discomfort was visible, not whispered, not hidden. Body language, emotional shifts, attempts to remove herself from situations. According to her, these were not moments that required insider knowledge to recognize. They were moments that anyone paying attention could sense. And yet, she claims, no one intervened. What stands out in her story is how often she emphasizes the word normalized. She explains that once certain environments become routine, warning signs lose their urgency. Behavior that might raise concern elsewhere becomes part of the atmosphere. Laughter fills the gaps where questions should exist. And when powerful figures appear calm, others follow their lead. She suggests that some individuals in these spaces may have relied on plausible deniability, not knowing details, not asking follow-up questions, not staying long enough to witness consequences. That distance, she says, provided emotional safety. If you don't look too closely, you can tell yourself nothing is wrong. According to her perspective, this is where influence plays a critical role. When someone at the top behaves as though everything is fine, it sets a tone. People below them mirror that behavior. Challenging, it feels risky. And when careers, endorsements, and access are at stake, risk becomes something to avoid at all costs. She describes how, over time, this dynamic reshaped her understanding of responsibility. It wasn't just about who caused harm. It was about who had the power to interrupt it. Who could have said something? Who could have changed the environment with a single question and chose not to? The public reaction to her story reinforced that realization. Instead of focusing on the dynamics she described, many immediately demanded proof of criminal behavior. Names became the headline. The system became an afterthought. She believes this reaction mirrors the same avoidance she experienced privately. In her view, society often treats silence as neutral. But neutrality, she argues, only exists when power is equal. When one person holds control and others benefit from staying quiet, silence becomes a form of alignment, not with wrongdoing itself, but with the conditions that allow it to continue. She is careful to say that awareness does not equal guilt. Being present does not mean participation, but she challenges the idea that presence carries no responsibility at all, especially when influence is involved, especially when patterns repeat. She recalls moments where she hoped someone would notice, not to rescue her, not to confront anyone publicly, just to acknowledge that something felt off. That acknowledgement never came. And that absence, she says, was louder than words. What troubled her most was how quickly things returned to normal. Events continued. Careers progressed. Public images remained intact. The contrast between her internal reality and the external calm made her question whether silence was simply easier than truth. By the time she decided to speak, she understood the cost: public scrutiny, online backlash, legal threats, being labeled unreliable or opportunistic. She weighed those risks against the weight of staying silent and chose the harder path. Doesn't ask the audience to assign blame. It asks them to rethink how responsibility works in environments defined by power. It challenges the comfort of saying they didn't know when not knowing was a choice. Because when silence protects influence, and influence shapes reality, the line between ignorance and intention becomes dangerously thin. And that is where the story deepens, not into accusations, but into accountability. By the time her story reached this point, the fear was no longer hypothetical. It was real, immediate, and deeply personal. The victim explains that deciding to speak out didn't feel brave, it felt necessary. Staying silent had begun to cost her more than the consequences of being heard. She describes the moment she realized silence was no longer protecting her. The emotional weight, the isolation, the feeling that her life was being shaped by something she never agreed to. According to her, the longer she stayed quiet, the more power the system gained over her narrative. Speaking became the only way to reclaim control. Once she came forward, the response confirmed many of her fears. Support existed, but it was drowned out by skepticism. Her credibility was questioned. Her motives were dissected. Every detail of her past was scrutinized, while the broader dynamics she described were often ignored. This imbalance, she says, reflects how society still struggles to hear victims without demanding perfection. She notes how quickly the conversation shifted toward legal technicalities and public relations. Statements were issued. Language was carefully chosen. No one directly addressed the environment she described. No one spoke about responsibility beyond legality. That silence, once again, felt deliberate. What hurt most was not denial, it was distance. The lack of empathy. The absence of curiosity. The unwillingness to ask uncomfortable questions. She says that silence after her testimony felt heavier than the silence before it, because now it came with awareness. Despite that, she does not frame herself as a hero. She frames herself as someone who refused to disappear. She emphasizes that speaking out wasn't about revenge or exposure. It was about breaking a pattern that thrives on quiet compliance, doesn't offer closure. It offers clarity. The cost of speaking is high, but the cost of silence is higher. And while the truth may not immediately change outcomes, it changes the record. Because once a story is spoken, it exists. And once it exists, silence can no longer pretend its innocence. If you've listened this far, this story clearly matters to you, and that's exactly why the conversation can't stop here. Situations like this don't change because of headlines or viral clips. They change when people are willing to stay engaged, ask uncomfortable questions, and refuse to let silence do the work for power. This isn't about choosing sides or rushing to judgment. It's about paying attention, about recognizing patterns when they appear, about understanding that accountability doesn't begin in courtrooms, begins with awareness. If you believe stories like this deserve to be heard fully, support that by staying involved. Share this video with someone who values truth over comfort. Leave a thoughtful comment, not to attack anyone, but to keep the discussion alive. Conversations disappear when engagement fades, and silence wins again. And if you or someone you know has experienced something similar, know this: speaking out is difficult, but being heard can change everything. No one should feel alone in confronting systems built to protect themselves. Subscribe if you want continued coverage that prioritizes context over chaos and questions over conclusions. Because real accountability starts when we stop scrolling past discomfort and start paying attention.